For a long time in modern history, economic inequality was treated almost like bad weather. It was unpleasant, sometimes even dangerous, but ultimately seen as something natural. Many people believed that the market economy would eventually solve the problem on its own. As long as economic growth continued, wealth would gradually spread more widely. If the economy kept expanding, everyone would benefit at least to some extent. This belief became so widespread that many people felt there was little need to seriously analyze inequality at all. Then one economist did something that seemed very simple. He stopped looking at the economy through the lens of decades and instead began looking at centuries. Welcome to the world where money, power, and history intersect. A world where things are often far more complicated than they first appear. This is the story of Thomas Piketty, an economist whose research challenged one of the most comfortable assumptions in modern economic thinking: the idea that capitalism naturally spreads wealth over time. This is not a story about ideology. It's not a story about political battles between left and right. Instead, it's what happens when you follow the data long enough that some of the most familiar explanations simply stop working. For much of the 20th century, economists focused primarily on economic growth, productivity, output, efficiency. These were the central topics. The idea was simple. As the economic pie grows larger, everyone will eventually get a bigger slice. If inequality appeared at all in the discussion, it was usually described as temporary. Sometimes it was framed as a stage of development. Sometimes as a side effect of progress. Other times, it was treated as a statistical issue that would eventually correct itself. For a while, history seemed to support this view. After World War II, inequality fell significantly across Europe and the United States. Wages increased, the middle class expanded, home ownership became more accessible, and wealth concentration declined. Looking at this period, many economists assumed that this was simply how advanced capitalism worked. But this conclusion relied on a very short window of history. Piketty approached the question differently. Instead of starting with theories, he began with archives, tax records, government statistics, income data, national accounts. And these data sets were not limited to a single country. They came from multiple countries and covered several centuries. When all this data was brought together, a very different picture began to emerge. The post-war era was not the norm. It was the exception. For most of modern history, wealth had been far more concentrated in the hands of certain groups than economists were comfortable admitting. The 19th century, the age of industrial expansion and classic literature, was not a time when opportunity was widely distributed. It was an economic world dominated by inherited fortunes. Economic power came less from working and more from owning. The dramatic decline in inequality after 1914 was not the result of markets suddenly becoming fair. The main reason was the destruction of capital. Wars wiped out large fortunes. Inflation effectively erased many debts. Taxes rose dramatically, and governments intervened heavily in the economy. Equality did not arrive gradually or politely. It arrived through massive shocks. As these forces faded over time, the old pattern began to return. Inequality started rising again. This is where Piketty asked an uncomfortable question. Why does wealth tend to concentrate again over time? For him, this was not a moral question. It was a mechanical one. To answer it, he highlighted a fundamental distinction in economics: the difference between labor and capital. Labor is income earned through work, wages and salaries. Capital, on the other hand, consists of assets people own: land, real estate, stocks, businesses, and bonds. And here we find a crucial asymmetry at the center of the system. Labor has natural limits. People can only work a certain number of hours, and productivity can only increase at a certain pace. Capital, however, does not face these same limits. Capital grows and compounds over time. It does not need to work harder next year. This is where Piketty's famous principle comes in. When the average return on capital exceeds the growth rate of the economy, wealth accumulated in the past grows faster than income earned in the present. The idea may sound technical, but the logic is simple. If you already own assets, your wealth tends to grow faster than the economy itself. If you don't, you're trying to catch up to something that is steadily accelerating away from you. This is not a conspiracy, it's arithmetic. And over long periods of time, arithmetic tends to win. Historical data shows that this dynamic has repeated itself across different countries and different eras. Before the 20th century, economic power was largely built on inherited wealth. After wars and major political interventions, inequality declined. But as growth slowed and capital recovered, the old pattern gradually returned. This was not a temporary anomaly. It was a tendency within the system itself. That's why Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, attracted so much attention when it was published. Because the research challenged a powerful narrative that modern societies like to tell themselves, that inequality is mainly the result of individual talent and hard work, and that markets reward contribution. Piketty's research suggested something more complicated. Markets are very effective at creating wealth, but they are even more effective at preserving and amplifying wealth that already exists. This becomes especially visible in periods of slow economic growth. When growth is fast, wages can rise alongside capital. But when growth slows, the returns to capital often remain strong. This is when the real-world consequences become visible. Rising real estate prices primarily benefit homeowners. Stock market gains reward those who already hold assets. In such conditions, inheritance becomes more important, and economic opportunity increasingly depends on when and where someone is born. These ideas unsettled many people. Critics argued that Piketty's view was too pessimistic. They believed innovation, new technologies, and entrepreneurship would continually disrupt old fortunes. There is some truth to that. But Piketty's argument was different. Individual success stories do not necessarily change the broader systemic pattern. Exceptions exist, but the average outcomes tell a different story. If we only examine the post-war period, inequality can appear solved. But when we zoom out and look at a much longer timeline, a different pattern appears. Equality is rarely the long-term norm. Wealth concentration, on the other hand, tends to reappear again and again. History suggests that major reductions in inequality rarely come from gradual market adjustments. Instead, they usually follow large disruptions: wars, inflation, major tax reforms, and political transformations. This realization challenges the way modern societies like to see themselves. If inequality is structural, then it's not just about individual choices or mistakes. It's about how the financial system distributes returns over long periods of time. And that raises difficult questions. Who benefits when asset prices rise faster than wages? Who gains when economic growth slows, but returns on capital remain high? Who is protected within this system? and who is exposed to risk. Piketty never claimed to offer simple solutions. His goal was to provide a diagnosis, a long-term picture of how wealth behaves as it accumulates. The core conclusion of his research is straightforward. Inequality does not disappear on its own. It persists unless something actively counteracts it. Markets are not designed to distribute outcomes evenly. They distribute returns based on ownership. Understanding this dynamic does not force anyone into a particular political position. But it does change how we think about risk, opportunity, and financial security. Because if wealth naturally tends to concentrate, then financial literacy cannot be only about budgeting or discipline. It must also involve understanding how assets behave, how capital compounds, and how long-term trends can overpower short-term effort. This perspective shifts the conversation in an important way. The question is no longer just, why does inequality exist? The deeper question becomes, how does inequality reproduce itself over time? Once you understand this mechanism, the questions begin to change. Instead of asking only, how hard should I work? You start asking, what do I own? Because while history may not repeat itself exactly, capital has certain habits. And one of its strongest habits is accumulation. If nothing interrupts it, wealth tends to gather where it already exists. Understanding this is not about resentment or ideology. It's about seeing reality clearly. Because if we mistake a structural tendency for a temporary phase, we don't just misunderstand history. We misunderstand risk. And if this perspective gave you something new to think about, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.